All righty.
Hello, hello. We're tuned in to another episode of the Vintage House Show. The show normally broadcast on WNUR 89.3 FM, Evanston, Chicago, on the campus of Northwestern University. Tonight's Vintage House is another edition of the at-home version of the Vintage House Show. And your host, your main man, Mega, is joined by the one and only author, DJ, remixer, producer, all around good guy, and certainly a true pioneer of house music, Jesse Saunders. Jesse, how are you?
I'm good, man. You got to be my publicist.
Touche. That is a conversation that Jesse and I have been having, and yes, we've got to finish that conversation. As we do each week, we talk about the purpose and intent of the Vintage House Show, being the premier on-air radio show and podcast, which is dedicated to illuminating and preserving the lives, music, careers, and history of house music pioneers such as Jesse Saunders. We're powered by the Modern Dance Music Research and Archiving Foundation. Excuse me. It's the only repository in the United States dedicated solely to the study, preservation, and celebration of the genres of house and dance music. Our mission, in short, is to preserve the memories, the memorabilia, and the stories that support the sustainability of the culture we know and love called house music. Our guest tonight is not at all.
That's a mouthful.
It is. It really is a mouthful.
Right.
And it's important because we want the academics, the movie makers, the book writers to all know that this is legit. Everyone tuned in tonight knows how legit the Vintage House Show is. We've been pioneering this format even before COVID, but we are glad to see so many others also documenting this history. Mm-hmm. So talking about documenting history of house music, we certainly want to acknowledge the impactful work that you've done in authoring 2 books, not 1, but 2, and encourage those who want to go beyond the scope of this conversation today to check out Jesse's books. You want to give us the titles of both? I think I may have one somewhere. You there, Jesse?
I'm here. Oh, I thought you said you were going to do it. I'm sorry. The first one is House Music, The Real Story, of course.
I stepped off that to go get the second one.
That's okay. The first one is House Music, The Real Story. Originally, the very first edition that I self-published was in 1999, actually. So it's 21 years old, believe it or not.
Happy
anniversary. And it was about, right? And it was about, 7, 8 years in the making, something like that. Then the second edition was released in 2007. That I collaborated with James Cummins, a Canadian writer, and we kind of updated and released that. Actually had a publishing deal through Publish America on that one. And then this last one, of course, was released on June 4th, and your main man, Mega, is featured in it.
Honored to be among the many whose journeys to discovering house music are documented in this paperback edition in their own words. So check it out. And again, you can go to jessesaunders.com or amazon.com and order your copy.
Amazon, definitely.
Excellent. And so we are October 14th. Normally in the fall, we would have had a cavalcade of events. You probably would have traveled the world. But here we are in our cars, in our homes. We are still documenting the important history of house music and its origins. And so we've been on panels and such, and we've talked about the timeline of the house music journey. For our audience tonight, can you share, let's talk about day one, if you will. Even though we all know that there was a movement and not necessarily one moment, but what in your mind was day one of house music?
You know, after writing 2 books and being interviewed hundreds, if not thousands of times on that very same question, I really, truly can't even tell you at this moment what was the beginning of house music. I mean, I can pinpoint it to a couple of things, places, times, people where the origin of it started to come together, but the actual inception of it, that's the hardest thing to do in the world because, you know, as you know, with this show and everyone that you've interviewed and everyone has talked about it, it's like everyone has a different story because they have a different place and time when it happened to them or what they heard or whatever. Now, I can go back and say that, you know, my pause button remixes that I did at the age of about 12, 13 years old could have been one of the catalysts. And I'm quite sure that it had, I mean, it's very important in the evolution. And for those who don't understand or don't know about those pause button remixes, I used to have a cassette deck. Remember those? They actually had push buttons and stuff, and it was tape inside a cassette. So I used to have one of those when I was a kid. And first I just started recording music, recording those little 45s and whatnot. But they were only about, you know, 3.5 minutes long at best. And they were so short. And all the best parts that I felt were the best parts were not being displayed properly. They might be a couple seconds here, a few bars there or whatever. But then it was all really about the song, which of course the song is important. But musically, it didn't allow it to really marinate in your soul and really get you to feel the groove and you know what we feel now, those long extended breaks and, you know, Afro house rhythms and things like that. We can feel those for 8, 9, 10 minutes, an hour if you blend them right and you can't tell the difference. But back then you couldn't feel those, and that was something that I was thinking about as I was doing it. I was like, well, there are parts in here that are really nice. If I could just extend those parts, then I think it'll be a lot more interesting to listen to. You could dance better to it. You could move better because your body can really catch the rhythm of it and everything. So I started extending those parts. And what I would do is I would have a you know, an old phonograph. I didn't have a 1200 back in those days. It was just a regular little phonograph thing with the spindle and all that. So I would plug it in to record in the back, you know, stereo inputs in the back, and then I'd have the outputs go into receiver, because back then we had receiver. They weren't just amplifiers. They were receivers with FM, AM, and everything on it, right? So I would put it in there on the auxiliary channel so I could hear back. So as I would play the record, I would release the pause button and allow it to record, you know, what the needle was playing on the record. And then when I got to the part where I wanted it to stop, I would push the pause button, and then I'd pick the needle up and either repeat it, meaning put it back in the same place that I started if I wanted to keep repeating a certain part, or I'd take it to another place to put that part where the other was. So these were what you know it today as remixes or re-edits and things like that. I started doing, and I mean, this is way back in the mid 70s. So I had this about 1974, 75-ish, and definitely into 76, 77. So in those days, I had a boombox. So I'd take these newly re-edited cassette tapes that I made of these songs. As a matter of fact, the first one I did was a song called Boogie Nights. I remember that, by Heatwave, because I love Rod Temperton, and that Boogie Nights was just my jam back in the day.
TK Disco Records, right? It was a 12-inch.
No, that was on. Well, yeah, but there was no 12-inch at this point. This is before 12 inches became. These were 45s, yeah, okay. Or album versions if I had the album or whatever. But there were no 12 inches yet, really. At least, especially not for consumers. There might have been 12 inches that first started coming into the market around that time, but I wasn't a DJ or anything, so I never got any of those, and I didn't know anything about it. So, anyway. I put these and play these on my boombox and carry it around, and people would start hearing things that they didn't hear in the records that they had or on the radio or whatever it was. They started asking me like, "Where'd you get that version? Or how'd you do that? Or whatever?" And I started telling them about it, and then people started asking for it. So as time went on, and especially when I got to Kenwood in high school, I used to play them in the lunchroom for everybody because I used to sit in the lunchroom 5th, 6th, and 7th period all day, every day. And people started getting into them again. And then when my brother Wayne, he had already started the Chosen Few, but it was with Batman and Jamie Shelton at the day. That was when they were in Mendel. Okay. And so by the time he got to Kenwood, because he transferred to Kenwood from Mendel, and he started hearing what I was doing. He was like, "Man, let's grab these tapes. I want you to DJ a party with me, right?" And I'm like, "I'm not a DJ, man." I had no idea that what I was doing was like the roots of what a DJ is and would become today. So at that point, I was just kind of like doing these tapes, and he had me playing at this party at the Burning Spear. I'll never forget. It was a doctor's party at the Burning Spear.
Wow!
And for the first time in 1978. Ish, if I'm not mistaken, it had to be early 78 or late 77. I'm not sure exactly what the exact time was, but at that point, we played them and loud. And from that day on, the Chosen Few as we know it today was born, because that was actually our catalyst to really kicking in and start us doing all the parties and events.
1978. And for those Chicago aficionados, where was the Burning Sphere?
It used to be right on a place that we called Derelict Row. Now, if you've ever heard of Dr. Derelict, which is Wayne, that's where he got his name from. That's why we called him Dr. Derelict. So Derelict Row was White Castle on 79th and Stony.
Mm-hmm.
And the Burning Spear used to be on 78th and Stony.
That I remember well. And while you were talking, I went and got some props. I've got some great cassettes, none of which necessarily have your extended pause remixes on them, but certainly for our younger viewers and listeners who may not know what a cassette tape is.
Yeah. Right. We need to bring those back. They're bringing vinyl back. Let's bring cassette tapes back.
We are starting the movement for the return of the cassette. Those digital recorders, who needs those, right?
Right? Exactly. I mean, when I think about that, just real quick, when I think about what I had to go through just to do that and where we are today and how easily you can digitally edit something like that, it's just amazing, because never in my wildest dreams in the mid to late 70s did I ever think that we'd be on a computer. I didn't even know what a computer was. Well, I take that back. I did know what a computer was, because I remember when I was in 5th grade, I was in this gifted program at the Ray School, Ray Elementary School, and they had these big, huge, gigantic computers. I mean, these things like took up the whole room. They were so big, and you had the punch card and everything. That was the first time I had ever seen or even thought of a computer. But to think that it would be this little small thing that we could have as a laptop, or actually even on our phones or whatever, never in my wildest dreams.
And so the evolution of technology and its impact on the music industry, and particularly dance music, has been pretty significant. You talk about, your evolution personally as starting with the pause button on the cassette decks and cassettes themselves. Talk about when you evolved to DJing with, the professional turntables, because I know a lot of early DJs, we worked on belt-driven turntables as opposed to the direct drive, and that was a leap. Can you talk a little bit about your move to direct drive? The SL 1200 MK2 obviously has and always seems to be the standard.
Oh, yeah, but the 1200, what it looks like today, and even 10, 15, 20 years ago, is not remotely what it looked like back in the 70s and early 80s. So, but for me, especially even Wayne, all of us at that point obviously didn't have that kind of money, because 1200s were really expensive back then. Only like the big clubs and professionals had those. So we had some little SL I don't even remember what it was, belt-driven turntables, like you said, which literally means just that. It had a rubber band that went around the table that made it spin. So it was actually a belt-driven turntable. And we had those for years, and I don't think it was until probably by the time we got to Sawyer's, maybe, we started using, because Frenchie had 1200s then. That's kind of when we started doing that. Maybe a little earlier, but that's the time I remember specifically.
Frenchie, for those who may, yeah. For those who may not know, Frenchie was.
Oh, you're asking me. Okay. I thought you were going to talk. No, Frenchie was the sound man back then. There were a few people that did sound. My cousin Kirk Townsend, of course, was one. As a matter of fact, he's who we rented speakers and whatnot, and sometimes turntables from if we didn't have enough. Because we were doing multiple parties back in those days. I mean, 2 or 3 on the same night, which is why we brought in Tony Hatch and Andre and Alan and so on and so forth, so we could do all of them. But the point was that Frenchie used to set up most of the sound at Sawyer's. And Kirk and Wall to Wall Sound did most of the sound at the playground. Well, actually, they did those big, huge 7-footers at the playground. They did all the sound at the playground. And then Kirk, of course, did his own sound at Mendel.
The bi-level disco. And
the bi-level disco.
We're actually planning an episode with Kirk and several of the other pioneers, Wayne and a few other folks that will explore in depth the nights of the bi-level discos as well. And so that's helpful to know that as you move from direct drive or belt drive to direct drive turntables, you know, where some of those venues were and why you had access to those devices and the upgraded equipment, moving from the cassette deck to the belt drive turntable to direct drive. And obviously the medium changed as well. So instead of a cassette, you were now working with vinyl that one record or one song or maybe 2 on one side of a 12-inch, as opposed to albums, which have always been 12 inches, but were up to 10 or more songs. And so can you talk about, which we haven't talked a lot about here on the show, how often were you using albums versus a 12-inch release, something dedicated solely to sort of the dance floor and club environment?
Well, when I became a DJ, like for real, you know, was with Wayne when we, you know, the Chosen Few, that second coming of the Chosen Few was when I actually started. He taught me how to play, and I wanted to take that to a different level. So at first, I think when I first started playing on them was about 77. Okay. I was 15 years old at the time, and taking that as a next step from the cassette as a segue, I wanted to do what I did with a cassette deck on turntables. So that's where the kind of the remix, re-edit thing came from, because, you know, especially in a couple of years later after that, when I met Farley and we met Steve, we all took a very distinct interest in the tricks of working on a turntable as opposed to just playing and mixing music. So we would battle each other in terms of how many repeats you could do in a row, 1 beat, 2 beat, 4 beat, whatever it happened to be, taking a song that might only be 5 minutes long and making it 10 minutes long, and again doing the same things, the repeats and the whole 9 yards that I would do on a pause button. So that was kind of when what really interested me about being a DJ. It wasn't the actual playing of the music. I mean, mixing records together was fun, but that was just, I mean, you know, I felt anybody could do that, but how many people could actually remix and re-edit records right on the turntable? In order to do that, you had to have at least 2 copies. So sometimes I have 3 or 4, and sometimes I use 3 or 4 turntables to do different things to each one of them. Because for me, it was all about making records do what they weren't supposed to, the same as they were with the cassette deck. So it's just kind of an extension of the same thing.
And what I find interesting is there were a lot of people who, as you were describing, sometimes you would use more than 2 turntables, 3 or 4, and very often it was about recreating live a sound experience using a familiar record or track, and creating something new on the go. And of course, the way technology has evolved today, that still happens, and the performance has, some would say, elevated. Others would say that people have become very dependent on the technology. But in Chicago in particular, with the evolution of hot mix radio, right, there were a lot of tricks that people would perform, double tracking and creating the flange effect, using the 2 records.
That was too easy. That was too easy. If you did that and you thought that was something great, we'd laugh at you, because anybody could do that. That didn't take any real skill.
The flange, double tracking and creating syncopation with the beats, and some of the other spinning the records backwards. Some would say that that as an art form or approach, not necessarily went away, but it evolved, and there's become this increased level of sophistication, right? Of how long can you let the blend ride, or how long can you extend the record and really take people on a journey. Can you talk about your style a little bit in that context of what you preferred, or what you enjoy, or what you think really moves the crowd the most these days?
Well, as I started to find my style and my groove and what I wanted to portray or have people experience in the journey, it usually had to do with 2 things. One, it had to be flawless. For one, the mix had to be flawless, where you could not hear that there were 2 records playing at the same time, which meant that I had to figure out points and spaces and parts where 2 records could sync up. It also made me draw on my musical education in terms of harmonics and key signatures and so on and so forth, so that I wasn't mixing one record that was in the key of B with another one that was in the key of C, which, if you're a musical person, that would be as dissonant and harsh sounding to the ears as possible, because those 2 bass lines, chords, progressions, and everything else would not gel together. So one of the things that I knew also, even if it was harmonically in sync, was that you don't mix. This is one of my biggest pet peeves with DJ. You do not mix music over music, especially if they are not in the same key, and especially if the bass lines do not gel in terms of progression. It can also be the keyboard, but usually it's the bass line that's the worst part, because you've got 2 things that are fighting each other that should be working together, and that will in no way, form, ever give you the right type of sync in terms of mixing something so that it's actually becomes cohesive until the mix is out. So I say that with an exclamation point, because I'm telling you, that's one of my biggest, hugest pet peeves with a lot of DJs, that they do that. And I wanna say that they don't know any better, but sometimes I don't think they really care. They just feel like they want to mix it there, so that's what they do, But anyway, my style was based upon the fact that I wanted everything to gel, flow harmoniously, rhythmically, and everything, so that experience would become one long experience as opposed to a bunch of different songs. So in essence, taking the concept of remixing one record, where by taking parts and moving them around or extending them, I wanted to be able to do that with my second record, third record, fourth record, and so on and so forth. So that was the main thing. The other thing was, you know, of course, it had to be good music. It had to be heartfelt, soulful, you know, rhythmic type of music. I mean, even to this day, it's amazing with all of the promos that I get from people. And my show, my Global House show, has been running for 22 years now. And
tell us how we can tune in.
Oh my God! Well, it's syndicated, so it's almost in every country you can hear it right now. It's on Power 88 out of Las Vegas with my homies Roy McAllister from Chicago, and Harry A from Chicago as well. And we're also on there with Mel Starr from New York, who's Houdini's DJ.
Okay.
DJ for a bunch of people, actually. But we do a show over there on Saturday nights from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. Pacific time.
Yeah.
It also runs on a station called Hands On Radio, which to me is one of the best house music stations in the world by far. DJ Spin is on there. Everybody who is a soulful, you know, producer has a show on there. I mean, it's just amazing. You need to tune into there for sure. But we're on 5 p.m. Pacific time on Hands On Radio on Fridays. That's 7 p.m. Central. And it runs down in Australia on Bondi Radio, and which is, I think over here, let's see, Pacific time, that's 12 p.m. over here. No, I'm sorry. Over here, it's 5 p.m. And it's actually Sunday over there, believe it or not.
Yeah, we'll do the conversions of time zones for our audience, and so check out Jesse Saunders on Hands On Radio. With the show is called
The Global House Show.
The Global House Show. So,
so what I was saying, real quick, let me finish that. What I was saying that, you know, a lot of people have heard this show again because it's been 22 years running and so on and so forth. So to this day, I'm still amazed that people will send me, after hearing my show for so long and knowing where I am, that they'll send me something that's just totally not even in accord with what my show is about. And that indicates to me that people aren't paying attention to what, you know, the music is. Because to me, the groove is everything. Putting a great vocalist and a great song on top is just the pinnacle. So if I don't have those things, please don't send it to me if you don't have that in your song, because I'm not going to listen to it. It's not going on the show.
I want to elaborate on that a little bit. Scott Allison was so kind to put the URL for the Hands On Radio show.
Yeah, I had Scotty on as a guest last week, actually.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in to the Vintage House Show this week, Scott. And what I wanted to challenge was there was a time early on, and even your chosen few DJ colleagues have sort of teased you about this. You would find ways to incorporate music from a variety of genres, including rock and roll, into your set.
Oh, yeah. That's part of the foundation. Yeah. Okay.
Let's talk about that content, because what you just described, I wouldn't say runs contrary, but it certainly goes a slightly different direction in terms of how you're still taking people on a journey, a groovy journey, right? That's important. And as the operator and producer of Philosophical Grooves, I get and understand everything you were describing in terms of how to really bring the craft and the musicianship to bear in DJing. But how did you? I mean, I can remember listening live to you at a party where you might bring in Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin or the Talking Heads into a groovy as hell mix. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, you know, I am very diverse in my musical tastes. Okay, I started off as a kid listening to classic rock. That was it, man. I was all Fleetwood Mac and and excuse me, the Eagles, and shoot, some Mrs. Robinson, back in the day, and all that kind of stuff. That's what I grew up on. So for me, and that does translate. If you really look at the evolution of my career through how things have happened, songs I've written, things that I produced, it all follows a certain pattern. For me, it all started with the song, the melody, the lyrics, a simple song. What I loved about classic rock was most of it was someone with a guitar singing on a microphone that wrote that song. And it was a beautiful melody, beautiful lyrics, and the chord progression. And then you add in, bass and drums and so on and so forth. But the foundation of it was just that guitar. Singer-songwriter is what it's called. And that's always been my favorite. Even today, that's still my favorite type of music to be written and performed. So I started there, and it wasn't until maybe a few years later, around the time when I started getting into doing those pause button remixes and stuff, when I discovered my aunt's catalog, basically her record collection, where I would sit over in the front room, because my aunt and my grandmother lived in the same space. So I would go over to my grandmother, and my aunt would be there. She was the music lady. She'd be the one in the taverns and telling all the stories and laugh. She was the life of the party kind of person. So she had all the music. So I'd go through her collection and listen to everything. I remember, Rock the Boat, Hughes Corporation, and, Do the Hustle, Van McCoy, all that kind of stuff, and that I had never heard before. And this is right around the time, and this actually is referenced in my book, where disco actually became a thing, so to say. And I say a thing in terms of when it actually had gone commercial and people knew of disco. So mid-'70s was around that time, even though disco, what we call proto-disco, had been around for a while. I mean, as early as like late 60s, early 70s, there were items and things in music that were the foundation of what will become disco. So anyway, let me digress here. So I went from classic rock to listening to R&B-ish, but then disco, because really disco was R&B. I mean, real disco came from R&B at the time, right? So then we also have Motown, which if you listen to a lot of those Ashford and Simpson songs, a lot of those Norman Whitfield songs for the Temptations and whatnot from those days, they were very disco sounding. They called it psychedelic funk at the time, but it was really more disco than anything, but we didn't know disco. So anyway, so we get through that point, and then we get into the age where you started to have things like Foxy, Get Off, and Peter Brown, Do You Want to Get Funky With Me, and all that, which was different than that other stuff, right? So then as you start to go along, you really start getting into disco, and you start hearing First Choice and, MFSB and the OJs, I Love Music, and, all that kind of stuff. That took us into the late 70s. Then it started going really, really, really pop. Franz Jolie, Come to Me, which is one of my favorite songs, but it was super pop, right? And, we had a bunch of other, then Disco DAI comes along in 79. Right? So then we get into, where the Warehouse becomes popular and Frankie starts bringing this New York style in there. Even though Ron Hardy had already been playing a lot of that stuff, and a few other people had been playing, Mike Ezebuku and you name it. Other people in Chicago were playing it, but Frankie came in and brought a different mystique to it, which is why the Warehouse became so infamous, right? And then as we start to get into the 80s, we start to get into the punk out age, which again really was rock. But it was that rebellious rock of the B-52s, the Devo, and stuff like that, right? So once we get into that kind of gel, and I like to think I had a lot to do with that, but I know, Wayne and I used to help Herb Kent with his Punk Out show on WXFM. So he got a lot of that stuff from us, that he was playing on there and breaking and whatnot. And for me, I started playing at the Playground in the beginning of 82. At the Playground, I had free reign to play whatever I wanted to play, so I did. So that's what you hear them talking about. All of my roots, all of the things that I love, all my styles and everything came together at the Playground. And the Playground was where I finally got to a point where I could feel the music in terms of the dance element in it. Before, you could dance it, but it didn't have that same kind of pulse it started to have in those early 80s, right? So from there, making my own beats and putting all these different segues and different styles, fast, slow, medium, reggae, it didn't matter. I was able to blend those together because I made drum tracks that would go down in tempo, go up in tempo. I could use the actual the twist knob there for the tempo to speed it up or slow it down
Right.
while I was doing it. Yeah,
Yeah.
the pitch, so I could speed up or slow it down. And that became what we know today as the rhythm tracks, the B side of On and On, and the foundation of the A side as well. So, in essence, what I've just given you is a whole musical soundscape of various things that contributed to the inception of making those tracks and the Chicago house music sound starting and so on and so forth. So for me, music has always been about variety. It's never been about one thing or one genre. It's like elements from jazz and everything else can fit in there. You know, it doesn't matter what the genre.
And so in the 1990s, 94, 95, I worked with an editorial team up at a Canadian music magazine called Street Sound to develop what we call the Explorer's Guide to House Music. And it, in essence, has been one of, you know, of course, I'm going to be biased about this, but one of the most in-depth timelines of the house music journey. And I hear you, and I love what you said about the fact that for you, music is really not about the genres, right? It's really, music is a feeling. And in order for you to appreciate music, you have to feel it. But certainly to be able to describe and communicate about it and to share it, we use semantics, things like genres, and we attach the genres to the styles of music that we know and appreciate and want to share with others. And so we came to this place of house music. And then in the timeline we put together, certainly 1981, it was acknowledged that Chicago house comprised of music that had simple bass lines, that had a driving four on the floor percussion, textured keyboards, and these were some of the fundamental elements that you would find in house music. And by 1982, we certainly acknowledged that Jesse Saunders came on the scene and started mixing some of the earliest house records. Parallel to what was going on in Chicago, in New York, there was this notion of something, I called it club music. I remember getting into a debate about it. They were in Canada, at least, trying to attach this genre of garage house to what was happening there. That was the music coming out on Prelude and West End Records, the Peach Boys and D-Train and others, and Loose Joints. And Tony Humphries was a pioneering DJ around that movement as he had his Kiss FM show. Can you talk about, let's see what was happening in the mid 80s with what had clearly become a serious movement, because in 85 we had the birth of DJ International and other Chicago-based labels. You're muted for a second.
The birth of Chicago-based labels actually happened in early 1984. January of 1984, Jesse Records was started. You know, myself and Vince Lawrence were the ones that actually were the catalyst in making that happen with the release of On and On. So there was no DJ International, there was no tracks, there was no anything before Jesse Records at that time. And the labels that actually, well, I take that back. We can include Mitch Ball, but Mitch Ball was not a house music label at the time. Mitch Ball was a jazz and blues label.
Yeah.
It just so happened that for Vince, his father owned the label. And for Vince's 18th birthday or graduation, high school graduation, his father took him in the studio to record a song. That song became Fast Cars. according to Vince, he was trying to duplicate music that I was playing at the playground at the time, which the more disco-oriented stuff, the Italian stuff like that. Unfortunately, and the same thing happened to me when I did my first song, so I believe him. So unfortunately, the drummer played way too fast, and plus Vince's taste was kind of more in the new wave, avant-garde kind of thing anyway. So his sounds were already synthy, kind of new wavy sound, and then with it being really fast, it really made it a new wave song. So, you know, when he brought that act to me at the playground, I didn't at the time didn't know anybody that had ever made a record, right? So for me, it was like, oh wow, this kid, kid made a record. Let me see if I can break it for him and give him some support. Now, even though I didn't think Fast Cars was like the greatest record, what the heck is that?
It's Fast Cars. Is it?
I was like, what is that? It sounded like Echo or something. But even though I didn't think it was like the greatest record that I probably never would have played at the playground, I wanted to support it at the time. So that was really my motivation. And by doing that, I got to know Vince. And all of this is part of the story, because had one or two of these things not happened, we might not have house music today as we know it, to be honest. Because what I did was pick his brain. And that was after my original bootleg On and On by Mach 1 was stolen from the playground. So when it was stolen, that was my signature record. And, no one else was playing that B-side. Everyone else was playing that A-side. So for me, the B-side became my signature. And once that was gone and stolen, the only thing I could do was try to recreate it. So that was my idea to actually do that. Now, prior to this, I had recorded Fantasy, a song that I actually wrote in the beginning of '83 that I played for Vince once I got to know him. And he said, this is a great song. And he told his father. Huh?
What format did you play it for him on? Was that
on cassette? On a cassette.
Okay.
Yeah, everything was on a cassette back then.
Okay.
So I played it for him, and he went to his dad and said, "Listen, we need to put this out. This is gonna be great. Jesse's this big DJ around town. We'll get free promotion and people and whatever." So his dad did it, and he came to me and said, "Did you want to be a part of Z Factor?" And really, I didn't want to be a part of a group at the time, but I felt that might be the only way I get it recorded, because I didn't know any other way to get it recorded. So we did, and it became. Vince and I wrote a bunch of other songs, which became that first Z Factor album as well. And it took Mitch a long time. I mean, at least 6, 7, 8 months to try to even get it to release it, which is why On and On ended up being the first house record. Fantasy really should have been the first house record. Yeah. But because it wasn't released until later. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is, when On and On did come about, we released that on January 20th of 1984. After that, the next release I had was your friend and my brother, Dr. Derelick, Undercover. Then we did a song called Funk You Up, Those Pretty Girls, which became #1 in Chicago, but then in the Midwest as well. We went on. And after that, I did a compilation album called Dum Dum by Fresh. And I did, well, let's put it this way. I did Wanna Dance, Illinois, a whole bunch of other things in succession, right? And the idea at the time was to release as many records as I could, but I didn't want to do them as Jesse Saunders. I didn't want like 10 records on the market at the same time as it said Jesse Saunders. So I would start to make up names. I made up Fresh. I made up Illinois. I made up all these other groups, the Gwendolyn records. I mean, she was an actual singer, but hers was under Gwendolyn as well. And released all these records, and that became the beginning of tracks, because Larry Sherman at the time was like, well, we need a label to put out these tracks, because I was doing songs on one side and then we were doing just tracks on the other, right? So the track label, we wanted just for the tracks, and that's where tracks came from, right? Okay. So we did that, and then right after that, Steve Hurley came to me with a cassette. Again, played it for me. He played the beginnings of what would be Music is the Key. And I listened to it. I'm like, oh, it's a great track. Put some vocals on it. Next thing I know, here comes DJ International releasing Music is the Key. And I'm thinking, why would you go to Rocky Jones instead of bringing it to me, or bringing it back to me? But anyway, that started that label. After that, I started another label by the name of Dance Mania. which we know the Stacy Kids and the Mike Dunns and House Nation, all Housemaster Boys and all that came on that succession. So in essence, what I'm saying is all those labels, with the exception of D, and I can almost take a little bit of credit for DJ International too. And the reason why is because I went to Audio Talent, which was the pool that Rocky Jones owned, back in those days, and he picked my brain backwards and forwards about Jesse Records and what we were doing. And being young and naive, I pretty much, told him the whole 9 yards, how we do, blah, blah, blah. And he already had the pool, so I'm sure he knew how to promote. But he didn't know, what was going on. Anyway, make a long story short, those labels came about because... Huh?
I said it's a good story. Continue.
Yeah. All those labels came from a succession of On and On. From the inception of putting that record out, because again, had I not seen a place where they could be sold, had I not had a medium that I could play them 1,500 kids a night at the playground, had I not had Vince Lawrence there in my ear to guide me, had I not met Larry Sherman to press those records, had we not met Paul Weisberg, who owned Imports, etc., who bought those records, and whose salesman Frank Sells gave me the idea to even press the record myself and put it out. And I'll give credit to Frankie and Ronnie as well, especially Ronnie. Ronnie was a big influence on me in terms of the way he played, because Ronnie specialized in, and everybody knows it, those reel-to-reels that he would do those edits on. And for me, that was right in my foundation, because I had been doing pause button remixes and all this stuff all along. So to see him do it with a reel-to-reel, which to me was larger than life at the time, because I had never used one or never seen it. So Ronnie was a big influence on me as well. And Frankie, of course, over at the power plant at the time, he would play. Now, there's a story that Frankie would not play records for people. If you just brought him into the power plant, he wouldn't put it in. But I tell you, he played On and On the first time Vince and I brought that record in there.
That says a lot.
Hmm?
I just said that says a whole lot about On and On and what he heard and what it triggered subsequently.
Mm-hmm. And let me not forget the Hot Mix 5, because the Hot Mix 5 at the time was probably the biggest single influence in that record, because every mix you heard from January of 1982 all the way through the rest of the year had On and On in it.
Yeah, well, I remember, and this is, I think, when I met you, actually, was On and On was out, and I was a DJ down at the University of Illinois in Champaign, and there was an event that my DJ partner, Cedric Ball, and I hired you to come down and spin for.
Oh, yeah. I remember.
I'm a little foggy on the year, but it was probably 82, 83 ish.
No, it had to be, if On and On was out, it had to be 84.
84, you're right. I was just going to say. On and On was definitely out then, and you played that, and the crowd went crazy.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you the elements of On and On. What I really wanted to accomplish with that record. The first thing I wanted to accomplish, was obviously to get my groove back, to get my record, right? That was the foundation. But I wanted to take it to another level. In those days, records didn't really hit that hard, meaning like you don't get that solid like we have now where you really feel it, right? It was more because there were real drummers for the most part. And a real kick drum does not have punch like that. It's more of a softer thud, right? So you didn't have, and then they didn't really mix the kick and the drums up in mixes back in those days either, So in essence, what I'm saying was that the drive in it was very light. Okay. Now, if you had big 7-footers like we had at the playground, and you could put extra subs and things in there, then you got a little bit more bass, but it was still kind of whoopy. It wasn't punchy, right? So what I wanted to accomplish was to take an 808 kick drum and compress that sucker so that it was tight and punchy, so that when it hit, you would feel it all through the place. That was my main goal, is to make sure you felt it. And that's become the signature of what Chicago house music was all about, because that's what everybody latched on to, and that's what everybody wanted to make sure that the kick drum was prominent.
So, of course, it is Chicago house music, and controversy swirls in the Chicago house community. Some would challenge that, you know, that concept of that punchy bass wasn't original, or others got to it first. What do you say?
What do you mean got to it first? Meaning they released something with it in
they
it
might
first?
have released something that was a little different, that better defined what we know today as the Chicago house sound.
Okay, well, show me the record. Show me a record released before January of 1984 that had that.
And so I'm not challenging it, but certainly
I know you're not, but I'm saying I've heard people talk all the time, but like, show me the record.
Right. Well, for those who watch the Vintage House Show, we've had at least one or two guests who challenge that. And perhaps
I'll tell you one person real quick, because I got to get this on my chest. Chip E. Chip E keeps saying all this stuff. I'm like, dude, you were a kid coming down to my basement when I was making records. You had no idea other than what you saw in my basement, and you used my 808 to do it. So what the hell are you talking about? I don't get that.
We got to have you guys both on the show so that we can talk through these elements.
Oh, yeah. I would love to.
Yes.
I would love to. Because it's funny how he's the first one to say that and challenge that. And it's like, you didn't even make a record for another almost 2 years.
And so the good news is that all of these stories are important to the evolution of house music. And so I want to fast forward us to.
Oh, wait a minute! Before you do that, let me say this one thing, right? Let me say this one thing.
All right.
So you saw the documentary. I was there.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You saw it. You saw Chip E. and Steve Hurley sitting at the table with me while we were eating. Right?
I did.
The most prominent thing they said, and the thing that made the most sense that I didn't even know, was that both of them used my 808 to make their records.
Yes.
So again, I asked,
undisputable.
I ask, how in the world did you do it before me? Not Steve. Steve is cool. It's Chip that has the problem right here that I see, because he always wants to dispute everything, and it's like, you weren't even there. What are you talking about? And
so we are all, continuing to support the genre, and here we are in 2020. Yes, we're still having that discussion. But what's important to know, the Vintage House Show's mission is to document all of these stories so that all points of view are captured and can be debated further. But
there is no debate. Let's start that real quick.
Down the hammer.
There is no debate on that one. I've heard him say other things like, well, they still play Time to Jack. Where are they? I don't hear anybody playing On and On. It's like, okay, well, where are you? Because everybody's playing it. You want to look at my royalty check? That's another thing. And I just don't understand, because personally, I don't get involved in these debates. If you see all of these threads and all these back and forth, I don't get involved in it. To me, it's useless. To keep repeating and saying who did this first and who was that best and who's got this, and this makes no sense to me.
And again, it's interesting that there are multiple stories around certain themes of house music, and so we want to ensure that all perspectives are heard and everyone has a chance to put theirs out there. But I want to move the conversation to the year 2020 and the fact that people have been quarantined, some have been studio rats, grinding out new hits. How do you think and feel about the evolution of house music, some 34 years later?
Well, I love the sound. I love where we are, because sonically, I've heard some, and I'm an engineer, first off, engineer producer. So to me, what things sound like, the frequencies, the notching, the EQs, the compression, that's what I listen to in the song. Obviously, most people don't listen to that, but I hear some of the best mixed and engineered, songs these days, and that's actually inspiring me. That people who are using the technology to their advantage and
Yes.
taking it to the next level is amazing. Now, there's still a bunch of things out there that go get yourself an engineer before you try to put it out because it's not sonically there. My best advice to people like that is get a song or a track that's mixed properly, listen to it. And as you're mixing your song, try to duplicate the sounds and the feels and the compression and the levels of that. That will help a lot. As a matter of fact, I still do that. So that's kind of the best advice that I can give people who are doing music. But right now, I think it's some of the best stuff out there in years. And I think that people have had a lot more time to sit in the lab and do it instead of getting it right.
And so kudos coming from one of the pioneers of house music, Jesse Saunders, to all those who are making these incredibly great sonically sound records. And I want to say to you, Jesse, this has been one of the most technical interviews that we've had here on Vintage House, really talking about the nuance of the music and the technique of DJing. So I want to thank you for that. As we hit the top of the hour here, we want to thank everyone who's tuned in, but I want to ensure that people have a chance to hear what's new and next for you right now.
Well, as you know, again, the book, In Their Own Words, is out, featuring 83 of the most incredible journeys in and through house music. I am now actually looking for stories for volume 2. So if you would like to share your house journey, please get it to me. You can do it through Facebook or whatever. Just, get it to me. And the next thing that I'm doing is, I won't say the next thing I've been doing most of this quarantine is sitting on the beach enjoying myself.
That's right.
But what I'm doing, huh?
Some good self-time.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I am in the process of working with a city, actually, to develop that city culturally. So that's going to be something amazing. We'll be doing educational programs. We'll be putting together virtual festivals, and hopefully real soon there'll be people festivals and things like that as well. And culturally bringing in a lot of the Burning Man style art that I don't know, if you people aren't as familiar with the Burning Man, it's a huge movement that happens every August in the desert of Nevada. Tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people that come out there for it, artists of every different kind of culture and whatnot, and they make these big, huge displays, like sculptures. I mean, some of them can be 50, 100 feet tall or whatever. And the thing about it is, after they're done, it's like, well, where do you put it? What do you do with it? So a lot of it, what we're trying to do with places is bring it in as art. There are a couple of areas, small town areas, one by the Nevada border in a place called Magical Nipton. It's actually Nipton, California. Okay. They have a lot of displays out there. It's also kind of a campground retreat type of thing. They have tiny homes. They have teepees that you can stay in. They have an old school hotel, everything. And it's amazing. So there've been some cultural events out there that we're doing. As a matter of fact, we're doing something Halloween with them out there. And what else am I doing? I got some new music in the can that, working on a song with Carla Prather. I'm going to tell you something real quick before we get out of here. One of the things that has made me slow down. Now, I'll never stop making music, but what's made me slow down, has made me kind of take stock of things going on, is the current state of the music business. And for all of the producers and songwriters and vocalists and musicians out there right now, as I said, there's some great music coming out. The problem is there aren't very many outlets to make money on it. There's a thread going on Facebook right now about how well or how good TrackSource is as a source of understanding what good music is out there or how it sells. And one of the things about TrackSource that you have to understand is that, yes, the charts are driven by sales, but they're also driven by DJ charts. So if I have 50 charts on mine and you only have 2, odds are my chart position is going to be way higher than yours. So in essence, what I'm saying, it's kind of like that same thing that used to happen with the major labels, where when they would release something, they put it in the market, and SoundScan would dictate what the sales were and things like that. Well, what would a label do that's got a lot of money? They'd go in the market and buy up all the stuff themselves, so it would make them run up the charts. Thereby would generate other people going to say, oh, this record's hot, let me buy it. So it basically instigated sales for them. And it's a similar kind of thing, but the problem is that there's just not much money in it. I mean, if you're not doing volume, like a Louis Vega and people like Stacey Kidd, Mike Dunn, Terry Hunter, you got to do volume now in order to actually generate some real funds, if you're looking at it for the money. Now, if you're doing it as a hobby and you're doing it because you want to step out there, great. So that's been my biggest problem, because I come from an era where for one song, I would get $25,000, $35,000, right? So for me, seeing the era where people only wanted to pay you $1,000 or nothing at all was just discouraging to me, and just kind of cut back on my wanting to make more music. Now, I will always make music because it's in my blood. So yes, there's stuff in the can. As a matter of fact, I'm taking the Jesse catalog.
Yes.
And we're going to be reissuing and remixing a lot of that stuff. I was just talking to Tyree Cooper about that. He wants to do something. Terry wants to do something. So, I mean, we've got a lot of people that'll be behind it.
Yeah. All some of our guests here. And we're always open to others that you've worked with. We used to have a segment called Who's Got Next for the Vintage House Show. Maybe we'll reinvigorate that if you got a suggestion for Who's Got Next on the Vintage House. We'll take that suggestion. And of course, this is also dubbed the Philosophical Grooves edition of Vintage House. And so we have to ask a philosophical question.
Of course you do.
As we close out the show, your question tonight, Mr. Saunders, is this. If you were to equate bass as a musical element to an emotion, what would that emotion be?
It would definitely have to do with the heart and the pulse of the heart. And I think seeing as the heart is the catalyst that drives the blood through your veins and arteries and everything else, and the way you breathe and everything, it's your heart and soul, basically. It's your soul. It's, one of the things that as a matter of fact, in the book, a lot of people wrote about was the distinction between that 4 on the floor, 124, 123 type of beat that kind of is consistent with the heartbeat, and how that in itself makes you feel a certain way that you may not even know. I mean, the feeling just comes from within. But to me, everything is about that kick drum, man. It's like I've listened to probably millions of different songs and things and mixes now, and house-driven ones. And I'm telling you, it's the most consistent thing, no matter what. Doesn't matter what you put on top. If it's got that feel, that does it.
I love that. That's an amazing response. Jesse Saunders, ladies and gentlemen, pioneer of house music, friend of the Vintage House Show, frequent guest, but always dropping new gems and nuggets for us. Thanks for spending this evening with us on the Vintage House Show. Thank you for everyone who has tuned in. I'm your main man, Mega, for Jesse Saunders, for the BH crew, DJ Lori Branch, who sends her love to you, Jesse, and for our executive and founder of the Dance Music Research and Archiving Foundation, Lauren Lowry. For all of us at the Vintage House crew, be sure to tune in every Wednesday night, 9 p.m. on your favorite platform, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch. All of these platforms are available, as well as our podcast at vintagehouseshow.com. Everyone stay safe, be well, and see you next week with our guest, another chosen few DJ, ironically.
We're everywhere. We're everywhere. You can't get away from us.
Well, we enjoy having you guys, and we'll talk to you all next Wednesday. Peace and blessings.
Thank you for having me. And anytime you need me last minute, I'm always available.
Will do.
All right. Thank you, Kevin.